28 days. That is how long I sat alone in a vinyl hospital recliner while liquid fire dripped into my veins. My parents lived 20 minutes away. They did not visit a single time. Not when my hair washed down the shower drain in heavy clumps. Not when my weight dropped so fast my clothes hung off my frame like old rags. But a month after my final cycle, my phone buzzed against the wood of my drafting table. It was my mother, Brenda. She did not ask if my scans were clear. She did not ask if I could eat solid food yet. She typed, "Emma got that marketing internship downtown and she needs reliable transportation, so sign your Subaru over to her today. We will come pick up the keys at 4. I stared at the glowing screen. The air in my quiet studio felt suddenly very thin. I did not type out a paragraph of hurt. I did not ask why my healthy 22-year-old sister deserved the car I bought with my own money. I opened my camera roll and selected a photo of my treatment calendar. The image showed 28 squares colored in heavy red ink, proving my desperate daily need to drive to the oncology ward. I hit send. Before the delivery receipt could even register, I tapped her contact name and hit block. What my family did not realize was that my quiet refusal was about to trigger a chain reaction that would legally erase them from my life and publicly humiliate them in front of the only community they cared about. Welcome to Morning Revenge, where we sit with the daughters who stopped begging for love and started building fortresses. Drop a comment telling me your age and be sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next story. My name is Adeline Vance. I am 26 years old and I make my living mapping the anatomy of plants. My studio looks out over the tree line toward Mount Hood. In Oregon, we understand the necessity of a boundary. We respect the timberline because the harsh altitude simply does not allow anything fragile to grow above it. I had to become something that could survive the frost. She farmed my illness for social currency and left me to wither in the dark. Now Emma had an internship. Emma, who wore designer coats and glared at me like I was a broken appliance. Emma, who refused to take the city bus. I looked at the clock on my wall. It read 2 in the afternoon. I had 2 hours before Brenda and Emma expected to arrive at my door to take my only lifeline. They thought I was too tired to fight back. They thought a sick girl wearing a wool beanie to cover a bald head would fold just to keep the peace. They had no idea that staring at a mountain all day teaches you exactly how to stand your ground. The fob for the Subaru sat on the edge of my drafting table. The black plastic was worn smooth along the edges from the hundreds of times I had gripped it over the past month. I reached out and ran my thumb over the unlock button. The ridges felt sharp against my sensitive skin. Brenda and Emma wanted this piece of plastic. They saw it as a metal box on wheels. They saw a convenient way for Emma to avoid standing at a bus stop in the rain. They did not understand what this car actually represented to me. For 28 days, that vehicle served as my only sanctuary. The mornings always started the exact same way. The alarm sounded at 5 in the dim Pacific Northwest dawn. I dressed in loose layers because the medical port in my chest throbbed if fabric pressed too tightly against the bruised skin. I walked down the concrete stairs of my apartment building, carrying a plastic bag in case my stomach rebelled before I reached the parking lot. The Subaru was always freezing. I remember the rigid feel of the steering wheel under my bare palms. The frost coated the windshield, blurring the streetlights into dull gray halos. I would start the engine and sit shivering in the driver's seat, my teeth chattering in the hollow quiet of the cabin. I waited for the heater to blow warm air. Often the nausea hit before the frost even began to melt. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the side window, closing my eyes, gripping the armrest, waiting for the wave of sickness to recede just enough so I could safely shift the gear into drive. My job demands intense observation. As a botanical illustrator, I spend hours studying the exact angle of a stem, the specific shadow cast by a folded petal, the microscopic hairs on a root system. I am trained to notice the things other people walk past. I brought that same quiet scrutiny into the oncology waiting room. The ward smelled like sterile wipes and stale coffee. I sat in a vinyl chair in the corner near a stack of outdated magazines. I watched the room. I watched a silver-haired husband fetch a styrofoam cup of ice chips for his wife. I watched a mother lean over and pull a knit blanket higher around her teenage son as he slept. I watched daughters holding the hands of their fathers while the nurses checked blood pressure cuffs. I mapped the geography of their devotion the same way I mapped the veins of a leaf. I saw the way they leaned toward each other. When the machines beeped, the family members jumped, eyes wide with concern, searching the hallway for a nurse. They formed protective walls around the people they loved. They functioned like root systems, anchoring the fragile patients to the earth. My chair stood alone. I sat there with my wool beanie pulled low over my brow to hide the bald patches. My canvas bag rested on the empty seat beside me. There was no one to fetch ice chips. There was no one to ask the nurse how much longer the chemical drip would take. There was only the steady mechanical hum of the pump pushing poison into my bloodstream to save my life. During those long hours, my phone rested on the plastic tray table attached to the infusion chair. The screen remained a black mirror. It reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. It never vibrated with a message asking how I felt. It never rang with a familiar voice offering comfort. But the black mirror hid a different reality. One afternoon, during my 3rd week of treatment, the silence became too heavy. The anti-nausea medication made my thoughts sluggish, but I tapped the screen and opened a social media app. I scrolled past advertisements and local news updates. Then I saw Brenda. My mother had posted a new update. The image was a high-resolution graphic of a cancer awareness ribbon, framed by a border of praying hands. Below the image, she wrote a lengthy paragraph. The words burned into my memory. She wrote that this season tested her faith. She described the quiet agony of watching a child fight a relentless disease. She claimed her heart broke a little more each morning, knowing the battle our family faced. She ended the post, asking her friends to keep our family in their thoughts, because the emotional toll was becoming unbearable. I stared at the screen, the infusion pump whirred beside me. Below her post, the comments cascaded in a long stream of validation. Women from her tennis league and the local country club rushed to offer support. A woman named Carol wrote that Brenda was the strongest mother she knew. A woman named Susan offered to organize a meal train so Brenda would not have to worry about cooking during this difficult time. Brenda replied to Susan with a prayer emoji and a public message saying the support meant the world to her while she navigated this waking nightmare. My mother was accepting casseroles from wealthy neighbors, while I sat in a hospital chair eating saltine crackers out of a cellophane wrapper. She farmed my illness for social currency. She harvested the sympathy of our community to construct an image of a tragic, devoted parent. She wore my cancer like a designer accessory, showing it off for pity points, while leaving the actual patient to wither alone in the dark. The disconnect felt like a physical blow to my chest. It was not just thoughtlessness. Thoughtlessness is forgetting to call. Thoughtlessness is missing a birthday. This was a calculated performance. She needed the tragedy to elevate her own status, but she refused to touch the ugly reality of the disease. She wanted the spotlight without the sacrifice. She wanted the stage without having to learn the lines. I realized then what I was dealing with. My parents were not busy. They were not overwhelmed. They were curating a narrative. They viewed me as a prop in their play. And right now the prop possessed a vehicle the golden child desired. Emma needed reliable transportation. Emma, who spent the last month posting photos of her iced lattes and new manicures. Emma, who had not texted me since August. Now she required my car because riding public transit to an internship did not fit the aesthetic Brenda wanted for her youngest daughter. I looked away from the black plastic key fob on my desk and glanced at the wall clock. The minute hand clicked forward. 3:45. They said they would come at 4. They assumed I would fold. In their minds, I was the compliant, quiet daughter who painted plants and avoided conflict. They factored my illness into their strategy, assuming the fatigue would strip away my ability to fight back. They expected me to hand over the keys just to make them go away. I stood up from my drafting stool. My legs felt shaky, but the ground beneath my feet felt solid. I walked into the narrow kitchen and poured a glass of cold water from the tap. I drank it slowly. The chill spread through my chest, calming the lingering anxiety. I walked to the front door and checked the deadbolt. It was unlocked. I left it that way. I walked back to the living room and stood by the window looking out at the pines. The quiet of the apartment stretched tight. I did not feel the urge to cry. The grief burned away weeks ago in that infusion chair, leaving behind something hard and sharp. The sympathy farming on social media, the silence during my worst days, the sheer audacity of demanding the vehicle that carried me to my treatments, it all hardened into a shield. I heard the heavy sound of tires turning onto the gravel driveway below my window. A silver SUV pulled into the visitor parking space. The engine cut off. 2 doors slammed in rapid succession. Footsteps echoed on the concrete stairs leading up to my floor. The sound grew louder, steady, and entitled. They were not approaching with the hesitance of visitors checking on a sick relative. They marched up the steps with the rhythm of debt collectors coming to repossess an asset. I stood in the center of the room. My heart beat a steady rhythm against my ribs. The shadow of the mountain stretched long across the valley outside. The footsteps reached the landing. A sharp, demanding knock rattled the wood of my front door. The knock at 4:15 echoed through my quiet studio. The sound reverberated against the thick glass of the windows, disrupting the stillness of the afternoon. I did not rush. I placed the cap back onto my Micron pen, aligning the plastic edges perfectly with the barrel. I wiped my stained fingertips on a damp cotton cloth resting on my desk. My legs felt heavy, weighed down by the lingering, bone-deep fatigue that chemotherapy leaves hiding in the marrow. Each step toward the entryway required conscious, deliberate effort. I turned the brass deadbolt. The metal felt cold against my sensitive skin. I pulled the heavy door inward, expecting to see Brenda standing there with her arms crossed. Instead, the hallway fluorescent lights illuminated a different proxy. My mother, blocked from her preferred digital avenue, sent her most effective pawn to collect her prize. Emma stood on the welcome mat. My 22-year-old sister looked like an advertisement for a luxury lifestyle brand. She wore a pristine camel trench coat belted tight at her waist. A rich, expensive spray tan colored her skin, carrying the faint scent of toasted coconut and salon chemicals. A structured leather tote bag hung over her shoulder, the gold hardware gleaming under the dim ceiling bulb. She tapped the toe of a suede boot against the concrete floor, projecting pure, unadulterated impatience. We had not shared the same room in over 3 months. She had not witnessed the physical toll of my diagnosis. She had never seen the reality of the poison pumping through my veins or the aftermath of those treatments. I stood before her as a hollowed-out version of the sister she remembered. An oversized, thick-knit sweater hung loosely over my shrinking frame, hiding my prominent collarbones. A gray wool beanie covered my bare scalp. My cheekbones jutted out at sharp angles, casting dark shadows across my pale face in the harsh hallway light. I lacked eyelashes, bruise-colored hollows rested beneath my eyes. I looked like a fading ghost, haunting the threshold of my own home. Emma looked at me. Her gaze swept from the tip of my beanie down to the faded slippers on my feet. I waited for the inevitable reaction. I anticipated a sudden intake of breath, a softening of her tightened jaw, the reflexive flinch of a sibling witnessing severe illness for the first time. I expected her to drop her hand and ask if I needed to sit down. Nothing shifted in her posture. Her expression remained fixed in a mask of mild irritation. Her manicured fingers drummed a restless rhythm against the strap of her designer bag. She let out a long, exasperated breath that ruffled the stray hairs framing her flawless makeup. "Mom said you are being dramatic," Emma stated. Her tone carried the specific, whining cadence of someone inconvenienced by a delayed flight. She extended her right hand toward me, palm facing the ceiling, fingers curled in a gesture of demand. "I need the keys, Adeline. I cannot take the bus to my internship. The transit station smells and the schedule is unreliable." This moment crystallized the blind entitlement of the favored child. Growing up in the Vance household meant learning your assigned hierarchy early. Emma played the role of the vibrant, outgoing socialite. She validated my parents' curated public image. They rewarded her performance with designer wardrobes, paid vacations to coastal resorts, and boundless leniency. My role involved quiet compliance. I earned my own money, paid my own bills, and remained out of the spotlight. In Emma's mind, my possessions functioned as communal family property, available for her taking whenever her convenience required it. Her new internship involved marketing for a high-end real estate firm downtown. She needed to project an image of effortless success to her corporate supervisors. Riding a municipal bus did not align with the aesthetic she wished to cultivate. My vehicle, a well-maintained, late-model, all-wheel drive crossover, fit her requirements perfectly. I leaned my aching shoulder against the wooden door jamb. The solid frame grounded me, taking some of the weight off my trembling knees. I channeled the quiet endurance of the pines standing outside my window. Those trees weather freezing rain, heavy snowfall, and gale-force winds without bending. They survive by holding their ground. I looked down at her outstretched, expectant hand. Emma dropped her hand. Her perfect, symmetrical features twisted into a sneer. The mask of polished elegance slipped, revealing the spoiled, petulant core hiding beneath the expensive trench coat. "You are not even driving to work right now," she countered, pointing a rigid finger at my chest. "You just sit in this apartment all day drawing weeds. Mom said the doctors finished the treatments. You are acting selfish. You are doing this just to spite me." The word selfish hung in the stagnant air of the corridor. A girl who spent the last 4 weeks sipping iced coffees while I vomited into a plastic basin just labeled me selfish for keeping my own mode of transportation. I did not raise my voice. I did not waste my limited breath defending my exhaustion. I simply stared at her, letting the silence highlight the sheer absurdity of her accusation. Emma realized the guilt trip failed to penetrate my boundary. My lack of emotional reaction unnerved her. She pivoted to the weapon our parents always utilized when emotional manipulation fell short of their goals: financial coercion. "Dad told me to give you a message if you decided to act stubborn," Emma said. Her voice dropped an octave, adopting the menacing tone our father used when closing a hostile business deal. She crossed her arms over her chest, a smug smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, satisfied she held the winning hand. "He said if you do not hand over the fob right now, he will cut off your cell phone plan, and he will remove you from his health insurance policy by tomorrow morning." The words hit me like a physical strike to the sternum. My lungs seized, the air rushed out of my chest. Health insurance, the fragile tether standing between me and insurmountable medical debt. The safety net paying for the poison that shrank my tumors. The scans tracking my remission. The expensive prescription medications keeping my stomach settled so I could swallow water. My father knew exactly where to aim the knife. He knew I lacked the savings to secure a private premium healthcare plan while recovering from chemotherapy. He knew the cost of a single PET scan. He knew the price of the anti-nausea tablets that allowed me to eat plain toast. My botanical commissions covered my rent, my utilities, and my vehicle, but they could not cover the exorbitant out-of-pocket costs of an oncology ward. He aimed his threat directly at my survival. He weaponized my illness against me to appease his favored child. A metallic taste flooded my mouth. My heart hammered against my ribs, echoing in my ears. But I remembered the mountain. I remembered the timberline. I refused to let Emma see the terror blooming inside my chest. I tightened my grip on the edge of the door. My knuckles turned white, but my face betrayed nothing. I kept my expression as unreadable as slate. "The answer remains no," I whispered. My voice sounded rough, scraped, hollow by the confrontation, but it did not shake. "Have a safe bus ride, Emma." I pushed the heavy wooden door forward. Emma gasped, stumbling backward on her suede heels to avoid the closing panels. The brass latch clicked into place with a sharp, final sound. I slid the deadbolt locked. I stood in the entryway, listening to her angry, stomping footsteps recede down the concrete stairs. I had protected my car, but the victory brought zero relief. The stakes had fundamentally changed in the span of 3 minutes. This conflict stopped being a petty family argument over an internship commute. My father had just threatened to sever my access to medical care. And as I walked back to my drafting table, I realized his financial leverage extended much further than just my insurance wrapping around the very walls of the apartment I called home. The morning sun cast narrow shadows across the hardwood floor of my studio. Dust motes drifted in the pale light filtering through the Douglas firs outside my window. I sat on my drafting stool, staring at the blinking red light on my work phone. The steady, rhythmic pulse signaled a voicemail. Brenda fought her battles using public performance and proxy messengers, but my father operated differently. Richard Vance spent his career in corporate acquisitions. He viewed human relationships through the rigid lens of leverage assets and liabilities. When I refused to capitulate to Emma the night before, he decided to handle his eldest daughter the same way he handled a hostile takeover. I reached out and pressed the speaker button. The automated system announced a message received at 6 in the morning. Then my father's voice filled the quiet room. He spoke in a flat, measured baritone. He did not yell. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man canceling a minor subscription. Adeline, he began the audio, crisp and devoid of any parental warmth. Your sister returned home very upset last night. We are done accommodating this rebellious phase. You seem to have forgotten who facilitated your current living situation. 3 years ago, I co-signed the lease for that apartment because your freelance income lacked the required history. I plan to call your property manager at noon today and formally withdraw my financial backing. I suggest you start packing your bags. I stopped breathing. The air in the studio turned frigid. My father knew exactly the state of my physical health. He knew my immune system remained compromised from the chemical warfare waged inside my veins over the past month. He knew the sheer physical exertion required to lift a cardboard box would send me into a dizzying spiral. Yet he calmly promised to initiate an eviction, rendering a cancer patient homeless, simply because I refused to surrender my vehicle to his favored child. The message continued, plunging the knife deeper. Furthermore, Richard stated, you claim ownership of that Subaru. You fail to recall the $500 I wired to your account 2 winters ago when you needed snow tires? That constitutes equity in my eyes. If the key fob is not resting on my kitchen counter by lunchtime, I will contact the local precinct. I will report the vehicle as stolen by a family member. Have a productive day. The automated system clicked, severing the connection. The red light stopped blinking. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to shatter my drafting table. My hands began to shake. The tremor started in my fingers and traveled up my forearms. A cold, metallic taste flooded the back of my throat. The nausea I fought for 28 days surged upward, triggered by pure adrenaline and terror. I gripped the edges of the wooden desk, pressing my palms against the grain, trying to anchor myself to the physical world. He meant every syllable. Richard never issued empty ultimatums. He possessed the legal resources and the sheer lack of empathy required to execute both threats. He calculated my vulnerability, factored in my exhaustion, and cornered me. The conflict had escalated from a petty demand for a commute into a direct assault on my survival. I looked down at the archival paper resting beneath my trembling hands. I had spent the previous week illustrating a series on native Pacific Northwest flora. The page displayed a detailed rendering of fireweed and lodgepole pine. I studied the intricate ink lines portraying the pine cones. Lodgepole pines endure harsh, unforgiving environments. Their cones are serotinous, sealed tight by a thick layer of resin. They require the intense, blistering heat of a literal wildfire to melt the resin and release their seeds into the ash. They do not just survive devastation, they require the fire to grow stronger. Nature does not panic when the flames approach. Nature adapts. I took a long, ragged breath. I forced the air deep into my aching lungs and exhaled slowly. The tremor in my hands began to subside, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I could not fight my parents with emotion. Tears held zero currency in Richard's ledger. Pleading would only validate his tactics and confirm his dominance. I had to fight him with bureaucracy. I had to become the auditor of my own life. I pushed away from the drafting table and walked to the gray metal filing cabinet sitting in the corner of the room. The drawer let out a sharp screech as I yanked it open. I pulled out a stack of hanging manila folders, dumping the contents onto the floor. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the dull ache in my joints, and began sifting through years of accumulated paperwork. First, I hunted for the apartment lease. I found the original stapled packet from 3 years ago. I flipped through the dense legal jargon, tracing my finger down the margins until I located the guarantor clause. Richard had indeed co-signed the document when I first secured the studio. But as I read the fine print, a small flicker of triumph sparked in my chest. The clause contained a specific stipulation regarding lease renewals. The guarantor status only applied to the initial 12-month term. I had renewed the lease independently twice since then, utilizing my own growing credit score and steady botanical commission income. His signature held zero legal weight over my current tenancy. The property manager would laugh at his attempt to withdraw backing from a contract that expired 2 years ago. I set the lease aside, building the first brick of my fortress. Next, I needed to neutralize the threat regarding the vehicle. I grabbed my laptop, opened the browser, and navigated to my banking portal. I set the search parameters back 2 years, filtering for transfers involving my father's account. The ledger populated. I found the initial incoming wire for $500, labeled for snow tires. I continued scrolling forward, hunting through months of grocery purchases and utility payments. 4 months after the initial transfer, I found the outgoing transaction. I had wired the exact sum back to his account. In the digital memo line, I had typed, "Repayment for tires in full." I routed the document to my wireless printer, the machine word to life spitting out the physical proof of my independence. I took a bright yellow highlighter and drew a thick, undeniable line across the transaction. I placed the printed bank statement next to the lease agreement. Finally, I dug into the folder labeled Vehicle Registration. I pulled out the crisp official title for the Subaru. The state seal gleamed in the morning light. Under the section denoting the registered owner, my name sat alone. No lien holders, no cosigners. The car belonged to me free and clear, recognized by the state of Oregon. I gathered the documents and spread them across my drafting table, covering the delicate sketches of the lodgepole pines with brutal legal facts. The paper trail formed an impenetrable wall against his extortion. If Richard called the police, I possessed the explicit documentation to prove ownership and debt repayment. If he called the landlord, the original lease proved his irrelevance. I stood over the table, my posture straightening. The hollow exhaustion that defined my morning evaporated. I had dismantled his financial leverage, using nothing but my own meticulous record-keeping. I felt a surge of quiet power. I did not need to answer his voicemail. I did not need to defend myself. The paperwork spoke louder than any argument I could vocalize. But as I stared at the organized fortress of documents, the initial relief curdled into a new chilling realization. Richard and Brenda were willing to weaponize my housing and my transportation while I recovered from a life-threatening illness. They demonstrated a terrifying willingness to strip away my basic needs to assert control. I had successfully blocked this specific avenue of attack, but my medical history remained a gaping vulnerability. I glanced at the calendar pinned above my desk. A red circle marked the current date. I had a critical follow-up appointment scheduled at the oncology clinic this afternoon. As I gathered my keys, a cold dread pooled in my stomach. If my parents possessed the cruelty to threaten my shelter over a car, I suddenly needed to know exactly what kind of power they held over my health care. The financial threat was neutralized, but the medical proxy remained an unchecked blind spot, and my appointment with Dr. Thorne was about to uncover a risk far more dangerous than an eviction notice. The engine of the Subaru hummed a steady, reliable rhythm as I navigated the winding roads toward the medical district. Rain traced diagonal lines across the windshield, blurring the towering evergreen trees into streaks of dark green. I gripped the leather steering wheel, feeling the solid, tactile proof of my own independence. Richard claimed equity over this machine, but the vehicle responded only to my hands. I guided the car into the concrete parking structure of the oncology center, and the tires squeaked against the damp pavement. I parked in a spot reserved for patients, killed the ignition, and sat in the quiet cabin. The morning confrontation drained my limited physical reserves. My joints ached, radiating a dull throb that traveled up my spine and settled in my neck. Inside the clinic, the air smelled of aseptic wipes and industrial floor cleaner. I checked in at the front desk, hearing my boots squeak against the polished linoleum. A nurse led me back to examination room 4. I changed into a stiff paper gown, tying the flimsy strings behind my neck, and perched on the edge of the examination table. The crinkling sound of the paper echoed in the sterile space. I stared at a laminated anatomical chart on the wall, waiting for the appointment to begin. A sharp knock sounded on the wooden door before it swung inward. Dr. Silas Thorne stepped into the room carrying a silver tablet. His white coat looked pressed and immaculate. Silas represented more than just my oncologist. He existed as a central pillar in the affluent social circles my parents desperately climbed. For over a decade, he attended Brenda and Richard catered summer barbecues, sipping aged scotch on their patio while discussing stock portfolios and golf handicaps. His silver hair and calm, measured demeanor commanded respect throughout the Pacific Northwest medical community. He possessed a sharp, observant intellect, never missing a detail in a scan or a conversation. Silas greeted me with a warm, genuine smile. He set the tablet on the counter and began the routine physical assessment. His stethoscope felt cold against my back as he instructed me to take deep breaths. He checked the lymph nodes in my neck using gentle, thorough movements. He noted the pale quality of my skin and the lingering fatigue shadowing my eyes. "Your white blood cell count shows improvement," Silas noted, tapping the screen of his device. "The numbers trend in the right direction. But you look exhausted, Adeline. The physical toll is expected, but you carry a different kind of tension today." He pulled a rolling stool close to the examination table and sat down, meeting my gaze levelly. He crossed his arms over his chest, and his brow furrowed in a subtle display of concern. "I have to ask," he said, keeping his tone conversational but pointed. "I review the visitor logs for the infusion center. I notice Brenda has not accompanied you to any of these appointments. I see her posts online about your difficult journey. I assume she sat with you during the early morning shifts before my rounds began. Where is your mother today?" A heavy lump formed in my throat. For 26 years, I functioned as the silent custodian of my family public image. I deflected inconvenient questions. I absorbed the neglect and projected a facade of domestic harmony to protect their reputation. Habit dictated I invent an excuse right now. I could say Brenda felt unwell or that she handled the emotional weight of hospitals poorly. I could shield her one more time. I opened my mouth to weave the familiar lie. I looked at Silas. I saw the genuine empathy in his expression and the professional care he extended to me while my own parents threatened to render me homeless. The exhaustion in my bones eclipsed the lifelong instinct to protect my abusers. The fortress of documents sitting on my drafting table back home proved I no longer needed their fragile shelter. I closed my mouth. I reached into my canvas tote bag resting on the floor and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the text thread with Brenda. I handed the device to Silas. "Read the newest message," I told him. My voice sounded thin, lacking resonance in the sterile room. Silas took the phone. He adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the digital text, demanding the keys to my car so Emma could avoid public transit. He read my photographic response, containing the 28-day chemo calendar. He saw the blocked contact notification. His jaw tightened. The warm, conversational demeanor vanished, replaced by a rigid stillness. Before he could speak, I reached over and tapped the screen, navigating to the voicemail application. I selected the message Richard left at 6 in the morning. I pressed play and turned the volume to the maximum setting. Richard's flat corporate baritone filled the small examination room. He threatened to contact the property manager. He promised to withdraw financial backing for my apartment. He declared his intent to report my vehicle stolen if I did not surrender the keys by noon. The recording echoed off the cold tiles, laying bare the sheer extortion tactics utilized by a man Silas considered a friend. The audio finished. The automated voice announced the end of the message. Silas sat on the rolling stool in profound silence. He did not hand the phone back immediately. He stared at the darkened screen while his intellect rapidly processed the disparity between the reality he just witnessed and the elaborate fiction Brenda constructed at their country club gatherings. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The medical concern morphed into cold professional fury. Silas Thorne dedicated his life to healing vulnerable bodies. He watched families rally around dying children, sacrificing their own comfort to offer a fraction of relief. He now realized his wealthy social peers abandoned their sick daughter, weaponized her basic needs, and leveraged her illness for social sympathy. He had liked their social media posts. He had offered condolences over catered appetizers at summer events. He recognized his own manipulation at the hands of image-obsessed performers. Silas moved with slow, deliberate precision. He handed the device back to me. He picked up his silver tablet. He did not yell or express outrage. Men of his caliber do not waste energy on performative anger. They dismantle the root of the problem. He pulled up my electronic chart and began typing. The sharp, rapid clicking of the stylus against the glass screen provided the only sound in the room. His face resembled carved granite. The lines around his mouth deepened into grooves of permanent disgust. You will not respond to them, Silas stated, keeping his gaze fixed on the digital chart. You will not answer any calls from unlisted numbers. He finished typing and locked the tablet. He looked directly at me. The protective, fierce gleam in his eyes told me I just gained an unexpected, devastating ally. Brenda and Richard operate under the assumption that this situation remains private. Silas continued, dropping his voice to a low, dangerous register. They believe they can terrorize you in the shadows while playing the martyr in the light. They rely on your silence to maintain their social standing. I nodded, pulling the paper gown tighter around my shoulders. Silas stood up, pushing the stool back with his heel. He smoothed the lapels of his white coat. The fury radiating from him felt palpable, like a storm contained behind a tailored uniform. He walked toward the wooden door, resting his hand on the brass handle. I have a charity gala to attend this weekend, Silas noted, shifting his tone to something crisp and analytical. Your mother sits on the planning committee. She enjoys holding court at these events. He paused and his grip tightened on the handle. Before you leave the clinic today, he instructed you must stop at the front desk. Ask the secretary for your intake paperwork. We need to review the specific legal names listed on your emergency contacts and medical directives. If Richard possesses the cruelty to threaten your shelter, we must ensure he lacks the authority to dictate your medical care. The door clicked shut behind him. I sat alone on the examination table. The chill of the room seeped into my skin, but a different kind of shiver ran down my spine. The financial threats I neutralized this morning were merely the opening move. As I slid off the table to dress, I realized my father's leverage might extend far beyond a lease agreement, creeping into the legal documents that controlled my very survival. I walked to the front desk after Dr. Silas Thorne left the examination room. I needed to secure my legal intake forms just as he instructed. The secretary typed on her keyboard and frowned at the glowing monitor. She informed me the hospital network was undergoing a scheduled weekend software migration. My specific legal directives required a manual pull from the basement archives because the digital system remained temporarily locked. She told me to return on Monday morning. I nodded and walked out into the cold Oregon rain. That technical delay left me sitting in my quiet apartment for 2 entire days. I remained completely unaware that the first major blow to my parents' carefully constructed social empire was happening miles away in a brightly lit ballroom. While I spent Saturday evening boiling ginger root on my stove to soothe my aching stomach, Brenda and Richard attended the annual Pacific Northwest Health Foundation Gala. Silas detailed the entire encounter to me later. His voice carried a sharp professional disdain as he described the scene. The event took place at a historic hotel in downtown Portland. The ballroom featured vaulted ceilings, intricate gold leaf molding, and crystal chandeliers that cast a warm glow over the wealthiest residents of our city. My parents thrived in these opulent environments. They viewed charity events not as philanthropic duties, but as vital networking arenas where they could farm influence and secure their status. Brenda wore a floor-length emerald silk gown. She carried a crystal clutch that caught the light with every step. She moved through the crowded room with the practiced grace of a woman who considered social climbing a competitive sport. She targeted a specific group of high-net-worth donors near a towering ice sculpture. These individuals sat on regional hospital boards and controlled major real estate development funds. Richard stood nearby, nursing a bourbon. He nodded along in quiet agreement as Brenda spun her tragic narrative. She held a glass of chilled Chardonnay in her manicured hand. She lowered her voice to a theatrical, breathy whisper to ensure her audience leaned closer. Silas arrived at the gala late. He checked his coat and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. He navigated the room, greeting colleagues and former patients with his usual measured calm. He spotted Brenda near the center of the ballroom. As he approached from behind, her voice carried clearly over the low hum of a string quartet playing in the corner. Brenda leaned into the circle of wealthy socialites and sighed heavily. She placed a free hand over her collarbone, feigning deep maternal exhaustion. I am just so utterly drained tonight, Brenda told the group. I spent the entire morning driving Adeline to the oncology ward for her chemo cycle. I sat with her for hours while the machines beeped. Then I nursed her through the terrible nausea all afternoon. I almost did not come tonight, but Richard insisted I needed a break from the relentless caregiving. Silas stopped walking. He stood just outside her peripheral vision. He listened to the woman who had demanded my only vehicle just 24 hours prior invent a detailed fictional narrative. She stood in a designer gown claiming she nursed me through a treatment that did not happen. A lesser man might have caused a scene right then. A different doctor might have raised his voice, called her a liar, and created a spectacle for the entire ballroom to witness. But Silas operated with surgical precision. He understood that in this specific social echelon, a screaming match simply looks unstable. A quiet, undeniable presentation of facts cuts much deeper and leaves a permanent scar. Silas stepped smoothly into the circle of donors. He offered a polite nod to the hospital board members, instantly commanding their respect. Then he turned his focused clinical gaze directly onto my mother. Brenda froze. The Chardonnay sloshed dangerously close to the rim of her glass. Her confident martyr smile faltered, turning brittle and tight. Silas did not accuse her. He did not call her a fraud. He simply asked a hyper-specific medical question, speaking with the gentle, authoritative tone of a physician inquiring about a complex patient case. "That is truly remarkable," Brenda Silas said, ensuring his voice carried clearly to every single person in the tight circle. "I am fascinated to hear about this morning. Which specific anti-nausea protocol did the infusion nurses administer today? Did they push the Zofran through her port, or did they revert to the Compazine drip?" Brenda stared at him. The blood drained from her face, leaving her expensive spray tan looking unnatural and orange under the chandelier light. Silas did not break eye contact. "Furthermore," he continued, his tone dripping with polite confusion, "I must ask which attending physician ordered this emergency chemo round without consulting me?" Adeline concluded her final infusion cycle exactly 4 weeks ago. The string quartet continued playing a lively concerto in the background, but the circle of donors plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits. A prominent local philanthropist lowered her champagne flute, looking back and forth between the respected oncologist and the stammering socialite. Brenda opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She resembled a fish pulled from the Columbia River, gasping for air on dry land. The emerald silk gown suddenly looked less like a symbol of wealth and more like a cheap theatrical costume. Silas did not offer her a way out. He did not fill the silence with a polite change of subject to ease the tension. He let the awkwardness stretch. He let the quiet humiliation expand until it consumed the entire group. He watched Brenda frantically search her mind for a lie that could counter his irrefutable medical facts. She found nothing. Richard stepped forward, attempting to intervene and salvage the conversation, but a single sharp glare from Silas stopped my father dead in his tracks. Silas reached over and set his untouched glass of sparkling water on a nearby cocktail table. The glass made a sharp clinking sound against the polished wood. He offered one final, devastatingly polite nod to the frozen group of donors. "I hope you enjoy your evening," Brenda Silas said quietly. "Please do not let your fictional caregiving duties keep you from the open bar." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without looking back. He left Brenda standing in the wreckage of her own performance. The social facade sustained its first visible crack. The wealthy donors quickly dispersed, murmuring quiet, polite excuses about needing to check on their spouses or refill their drinks. No one wanted to stand near a woman who had just been exposed as a pathological liar by the most respected doctor in the room. By Monday morning, the whispers would spread through the country club locker rooms and charity board meetings. The image of the tragic, devoted mother began to dissolve, permanently replaced by the chilling reality of a manipulative narcissist. But while Silas expertly dismantled my mother in public, I remained focused on a much more practical battle. The long weekend finally ended. Monday morning arrived with a heavy downpour that washed the Portland streets clean of debris. I drove my Subaru back to the oncology clinic, stepping through the sliding glass doors precisely as the records department opened for business. I approached the front desk and requested the legal intake files the secretary had promised me on Friday. She handed me a thick manila folder containing the documents I signed years ago when I first established care. I carried the folder to a quiet bench in the lobby. I broke the paper seal and began reading the fine print of my medical proxy. The sense of safety I built over the weekend vanished in an instant. It was replaced by a cold, creeping horror as my eyes scanned the signature lines. I realized exactly what kind of legal authority my parents still held over my life, and the true danger I faced if my cancer ever returned. I sat on the wooden bench in the lobby of the oncology clinic, holding the manila folder. The air around me smelled of bleach and impending rain. I slid my index finger under the paper flap and opened the file. The pages felt thick and heavy in my lap. These were the intake forms I filled out 5 years ago. I was 21 years old back then, a naive girl who still believed her parents possessed a shred of parental instinct. I signed the standard forms without a second thought, assuming family meant safety. I assumed blood meant protection. I had no idea I was handing over the keys to my own cage. Page 3 contained the critical information. I dragged my finger down the dense black text. It stopped at a bold heading, Advanced Healthcare Directive and Durable Power of Attorney. Underneath that heading, 2 names sat printed in neat, clear letters. Brenda Vance, Richard Vance. My stomach dropped. A sudden, sharp ringing echoed in my ears, drowning out the low chatter of the nurse's station across the room. I stared at the signatures, and the true weight of my situation hit me like a physical blow. A medical proxy does not just grant hospital visitation rights. It transfers jurisdiction over my physical body. If my cancer returned and I lost consciousness, Brenda would become the supreme authority over my treatment plan. She would hold the power to consent to surgery or refuse life-saving measures. She would control access to my hospital room. She could bar my actual friends from visiting and turn my recovery ward into a private lounge for her country club audience. She could use my comatose body as a permanent prop in her tragic mother routine. The financial implications looked even more terrifying. The durable power of attorney meant Richard could legally step into my shoes if a doctor deemed me incapacitated. He could walk into my bank branch and demand access to my accounts. He could drain the savings I built from years of botanical commissions. He could legally sell the Subaru he just tried to extort from me. He could terminate my apartment lease, pack my belongings into cheap cardboard boxes, and leave me destitute. They could strip me down to the studs while I lay helpless in a hospital bed. The demand for the car keys was never just a petty argument over Emma and her commute. The vehicle demand represented a fundamental belief system. My parents did not view me as an independent adult. They viewed me as an extension of their own property. They saw me as an asset they could liquidate or reassign whenever it suited their narrative. If Emma needed a car, they assumed they held the rightful authority to repossess mine. I stood up from the wooden bench. My knees shook, but I locked them straight. I refused to let the panic paralyze me. I walked back to the reception desk. The secretary looked up from her dual monitors. Her name tag read Diane. "I need to change these designations," I said. My voice sounded brittle, but I kept the pitch level. I slid the manila folder across the polished counter. Diane offered a sympathetic, practiced nod. She reached for a black pen from a plastic cup. "Of course, honey," she replied. "You can just cross out the current names and initial the changes right here on the margins. We see patients update these forms all the time." I pulled the folder back an inch, keeping it out of her reach. A simple crossed-out line felt insufficient. My father worked in corporate acquisitions. He specialized in hostile takeovers. He knew how to exploit legal loopholes and intimidate administrators. If I suffered a relapse and lost consciousness, Richard would arrive at this hospital with an army of expensive lawyers. He would point to the crossed-out names and claim my signature was invalid. He would argue the chemotherapy clouded my judgment. He would tell a judge I was mentally unfit and petition for an emergency conservatorship. A simple pen stroke would not stop a man who viewed human beings as line items on a balance sheet. I needed a fortress. "I need to revoke this entirely," I told Diane. "I need to establish a new directive with airtight legal boundaries. I cannot just cross their names out. I need them formally and legally barred from ever stepping foot in my hospital room." Diane stopped smiling. She studied my face. She saw the pale exhaustion in my cheeks and the tense set of my jaw. She saw the oversized wool beanie covering my bald scalp. The casual administrative routine vanished from her expression. She recognized the look of a patient running out of time. She lowered her voice, leaning closer across the counter. If you want to establish an ironclad revocation, we need to bring in the hospital legal social worker, Diane explained. We can draft a new binding document, but it requires formal notarization and official witnesses to ensure no outside party can ever challenge your state of mind. It takes a little more time than a standard update. I realized the precipice I stood upon. The 28 days of chemotherapy tested my physical endurance. The confrontation with Emma over the vehicle tested my emotional boundaries. But this document represented a fight for my actual bodily autonomy. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. If I drove my car home today and a reckless driver struck my vehicle at a busy intersection, my life would instantly revert to Brenda and Richard. They would hold the pen hovering over my life support decisions. They would hand my car keys to Emma while I lay in a coma. I could not risk driving home with this paperwork still active in the hospital system. The chill of the clinic seeped deep into my bones. The financial threat Richard left on my voicemail was just a warning shot. If he realized I was attempting to lock him out of my legal proxy, he might escalate his tactics. He might try to initiate a conservatorship, preemptively claiming my illness rendered me unfit to manage my own affairs. Wealthy, manipulative men do not surrender control quietly. They double down. I looked at the wall clock above the reception desk. The red second hand swept across the white face with agonizing slowness. I did not have days to resolve this. I did not even have hours. I needed to act before the whispers from the charity gala reached my father and provoked a swift retaliation. "Can I see the legal social worker right now?" I asked, keeping my gaze locked on Diane. Diane clicked her mouse, checking a digital schedule. "The social worker is booked solid until Thursday morning. I am sorry, Adeline. I can try to squeeze you in for a brief consultation on Wednesday afternoon if there is a cancellation." A wave of panic crested in my chest, but I forced it down. I remembered Dr. Silas Thorne. I remembered his cold professional fury when he listened to my father threaten my housing. Silas promised to protect my medical care. He told me to review these exact documents for a reason. He understood the legal danger I faced. "Please page Dr. Silas Thorne," I instructed. My voice carried a new sharp edge of authority. "Tell him Adeline Vance is standing at the front desk, and she needs his immediate authorization for an emergency legal consult. Tell him the proxy form's name Richard Vance." Diane hesitated for a fraction of a second. The intensity in my eyes conveyed the severity of the situation. She picked up the heavy plastic receiver of her desk phone and dialed an internal extension. As the overhead speaker chimed, calling my unexpected ally to the lobby, I gripped the manila folder tightly against my chest. The fight had shifted from a driveway dispute into a high-stakes legal war. I needed to build a wall so high and so thick that my parents could never scale it. The overhead speaker chimed, carrying my request through the sterile corridors. Less than 3 minutes later, the heavy double doors of the oncology wing swung open. Dr. Silas Thorne strode into the lobby. His white coat billowed slightly, catching the conditioned air of the hospital. He did not walk with the hurried, frantic pace of a physician responding to a code blue. He moved with the undeniable weight of a man who commanded the building. He approached the reception desk where Diane stood holding her phone receiver. Silas did not ask for a summary. He looked at the manila folder clutched against my chest and registered the pale, rigid tension in my jaw. Silas instructed Diane to cancel his next consultation and page the legal social worker immediately. Diane mentioned the Thursday availability limitation. Silas rested his hand flat on the laminate counter and lowered his voice to a quiet, uncompromising register. He informed Diane that patient safety superseded administrative schedules and directed her to open conference room B. The bureaucratic delays melted under his authority. I followed him down a quiet hallway lined with framed watercolor prints of local landscapes. We entered the conference room. A woman named Helen arrived moments later, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Helen possessed the sharp, pragmatic demeanor of someone who spent decades navigating the ugly intersections of family trauma and medical law. We sat around a circular oak table. I placed my intake forms on the wood. I explained the reality of my situation, holding nothing back. I detailed the 28 days of isolation. I described the text message demanding my vehicle. I recounted the voicemail where my father threatened my apartment lease to secure a commute for Emma. I explained the terrifying vulnerability of the current proxy form sitting on the table. Helen listened without interrupting. She unclasped her briefcase and pulled out a stack of blank legal templates. I draw plants for a living. I map the intricate root systems of the Oregon grape and the creeping rhizomes of the salal bush. I understand how hidden networks anchor a living thing to the soil. I applied that exact same meticulous attention to detail to my own legal survival. I did not want a simple proxy update. I wanted an unyielding barrier. I requested an irrevocable healthcare directive and a living will. Helen uncapped her pen and began drafting the paperwork. We systematically stripped Brenda and Richard of every single right they possessed on paper. We revoked their medical decision-making authority. We explicitly denied them visitation privileges in the event of my hospitalization. We removed their status as next of kin regarding the release of medical records and physical remains. Every avenue they could use to access my physical body or my financial assets was sealed shut with dense, binding legal terminology. But stripping their rights left a dangerous vacuum. A patient requires a designated advocate. Helen suggested appointing a neutral third party. We established a trusted, state-certified legal fiduciary to act as my sole proxy. If my cancer returned and I could not speak for myself, a licensed professional bound by a strict ethical code would make my medical decisions. My parents could not manipulate or extort a fiduciary. The fiduciary answered only to the law and my written directives. I knew Richard. A standard revocation might not stop him from trying to regain control. If he discovered the change, he might hire an expensive litigation firm to challenge the document in probate court. He would argue I signed the forms under medical duress or chemical impairment. He would tell a judge I was mentally unfit and petition for an emergency conservatorship to seize my assets. To prevent this tactic, Helen and Silas helped me construct a defensive addendum. I provided the exact dates of my chemotherapy cycles, proving the total absence of my family. I submitted the printed photograph of my treatment calendar as Exhibit A. I provided a formal sworn affidavit detailing the voicemail where my father threatened my housing security to extort a vehicle for his youngest daughter. Silas added his own formal medical attestation to the file. He verified my perfect mental clarity and cognitive competence at the exact moment of signing. He noted that my physical illness did not compromise my psychological capacity. The addendum transformed the proxy from a standard form into a preemptive legal strike. It documented their neglect and financial coercion, creating a toxic paper trail no probate judge would ever ignore. A hospital notary public entered the room to witness the final steps. The notary checked my state-issued identification, verifying my identity. She placed a brass stamp on the table. I picked up a heavy black fountain pen provided by Helen. I stared at the signature line. For 26 years, my signature represented compliance. I signed birthday cards thanking my parents for gifts they forgot to buy. I signed dinner receipts when they conveniently left their wallets at home. Now my signature functioned as a scalpel, severing the infected ties. I pressed the nib against the thick parchment paper. I wrote my name with steady, deliberate strokes. The ink sank into the fibers, marking the end of their jurisdiction. Helen signed as the primary witness. Silas signed as the secondary witness and attending physician. The notary pressed her brass stamp onto the bottom of the page. The metal left a raised, tactile seal on the document. The loud click of the stamp echoed in the quiet conference room. The sound felt like a heavy steel vault door locking into place from the inside. I stood inside the stronghold. The walls were smooth and seamless, leaving no handholds for my abusers to climb. Helen scanned the documents into the secure hospital database, bypassing the weekend software migration delay with an override code. She handed me a physical copy housed in a blue paper jacket. I held the packet against my chest. A profound, quiet relief washed over my aching joints. The invisible tether connecting me to their cruelty finally snapped. I owned my vehicle. I owned my apartment lease. Now I owned my own physical survival. I was legally erased from their world. I thanked Helen and Silas. I walked out of the clinic and the Oregon rain had stopped. Puddles reflected the gray sky in the parking lot. I climbed into the driver's seat of my Subaru. The engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting vibration. I drove back to my apartment feeling lighter than I had in months. The air inside the car felt breathable. But as I parked the vehicle in my designated spot, a new chilling thought surfaced. The legal wall stood tall and impenetrable. My safety was guaranteed on paper, but Brenda and Richard remained completely unaware of the fortress I just built. They still operated under the illusion that they held the winning hand. They still believed a sick, vulnerable daughter sat alone in an apartment ready to surrender her car keys. The silence from my phone over the last 2 days did not mean they surrendered. It meant they were changing tactics. When digital demands and voicemails fail, people like my parents escalate to physical intimidation. They prefer audiences and vulnerable environments where they can corner their targets and force compliance through sheer social pressure. I locked them out of my medical records, but I could not lock them out of the city. The inevitable collision was racing toward me. They were about to bring their demands out of the shadows and into the one public arena where they assumed I could not hide. 2 days passed in unbroken silence. The weather over the Pacific Northwest shifted into a relentless gray drizzle. I returned to the oncology center on Wednesday morning for a routine port flush and a comprehensive metabolic panel. My physical strength remained fragile. My bones felt hollowed out by the lingering chemical residue, but the legal stronghold I constructed 48 hours prior gave my mind an unshakable foundation. I sat in a secluded, curtained alcove near the back of the ward. A phlebotomist named Clara wiped the skin above my chest with an alcohol swab. The sharp medicinal scent stung my nostrils. The needle pierced the port with a brief, sharp pinch. I focused on the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitors down the hall. The clinic usually maintained a library-quiet atmosphere. Patients slept under heated blankets, nurses spoke in hushed tones to avoid startling anyone navigating the fragile edge of recovery. That sacred stillness shattered precisely at 10:15. The heavy, sliding glass doors at the front entrance opened with a loud mechanical grinding noise. A cascade of sharp, overlapping voices spilled into the reception area. I did not need to see the intruders to identify them. I spent 26 years learning the exact cadence of their entitlement. "I cannot believe the surge pricing on that Uber," Emma complained. Her voice pierced the quiet ward, carrying the shrill pitch of a woman severely inconvenienced. The driver smelled like old smoke, and he missed the exit twice. "I am going to leave a terrible rating. My shoes are ruined from the puddles in the parking lot." "Hush, Emma," Brenda instructed, utilizing her breathy, theatrical stage whisper. "Remember where we are. We must project strength for your sister. Turn the camera angle up a fraction. The lighting in here is dreadful, and it casts shadows under my eyes." Clara froze. She paused the saline flush and looked toward the hallway. A deep furrow formed between her brows. I placed my hand over hers and nodded, indicating she should finish the procedure. The cold saline rushed through the plastic tubing into my chest. I knew exactly what my family intended. They assumed the silent treatment failed to secure the Subaru. They calculated that corners work best in public arenas. They marched into a sensitive medical environment believing my exhaustion and the presence of strangers would force my compliance. They staged a performative visit designed to secure two objectives. First, they wanted the car keys. Second, Brenda desired a sympathetic photo opportunity to repair the social damage Dr. Silas Thorne inflicted upon her at the charity gala. Clara applied a square bandage over the port site. I smoothed the collar of my oversized sweater. I stood up from the padded chair. I walked slowly out of the alcove and down the corridor, stopping just out of sight behind the corner of the reception desk. I leaned against the painted drywall, observing the scene playing out in the lobby. Brenda stood near the intake counter. She wore a tailored beige raincoat and a silk scarf draped elegantly around her neck. She clutched a bouquet of cheap gas station carnations. The bright pink petals clashed against the clear, crinkling plastic wrapper. Emma stood beside her, holding her smartphone aloft. The screen glowed actively, recording the encounter. Emma tossed her glossy hair over her shoulder, ensuring the lens captured her perfect profile, alongside her mother's tragic, brave expression. Richard stood slightly behind them. He did not smile for the camera. He functioned as the enforcer. He wore a crisp navy suit and a rigid grimace. His jaw muscles flexed beneath his skin. He scanned the waiting room, assessing the terrain for weaknesses. He looked like an executive preparing to terminate an employee on the main floor. Diane sat behind the reception desk. Her dual monitors displayed my updated legal directives in bright red text. The irrevocable healthcare proxy flashed a strict warning blocking any unauthorized access. Diane stood up from her ergonomic chair. She placed both hands flat on the laminate counter. "May I help you?" Diane asked. Her tone lacked the customary customer service warmth. She projected a rigid administrative barrier. "We are here to see Adeline Vance," Brenda announced, projecting her voice so the half-dozen patients sitting in the waiting area could hear her devotion. "We brought flowers to brighten her day. It has been such a harrowing journey for our family, and we just want to surround her with love." Emma panned the smartphone camera toward Brenda, capturing the monologue. Diane typed my name into her keyboard. She kept her eyes fixed on the screen, refusing to engage with the lens pointed in her direction. "I am sorry," Diane stated firmly. "That patient is not accepting visitors today." Brenda let out a practiced, dramatic sigh. She looked around the room, inviting the strangers to witness her plight. "I am her mother," Brenda said, pressing her hand against her collarbone. "I have the right to sit with my own flesh and blood during her treatments. Just tell us which room she is in. We will not take no for an answer." She stepped forward, intending to bypass the reception desk and march directly into the restricted infusion wing. Diane reached under the counter and pressed a button. A charge nurse named Sarah appeared from a side office. Sarah possessed a formidable presence and a zero-tolerance policy for disruptions. She stepped directly into Brenda's path, blocking the swinging doors. "Ma'am, you need to step back into the waiting area," Sarah ordered. Her voice cut through the performative display like a steel blade. "This is a restricted medical ward. The patient explicitly revoked your visitation privileges. You are not authorized to be in this facility." The camera lens dipped. Emma lowered her phone a fraction, her brow furrowing in confusion. The script deviated from their expectations. Richard stepped forward, inserting his broad shoulders into the confrontation. He attempted to utilize the corporate intimidation tactics that work so flawlessly in boardrooms. He glared at Sarah, adopting a low, menacing register. "Do not tell my wife where she can stand," Richard warned. "We are the emergency contacts on file. I co-signed the financial agreements for her care. You will step aside and direct us to my daughter before I call the hospital administrator and have your employment terminated." He relied on the old paperwork. He banked on the intake forms I signed at 21. He had no idea those documents currently sat in a shredder. Sarah did not flinch. She crossed her arms over her scrubs. "The legal directives on file override any previous arrangements," Sarah countered. "Your names are permanently blacklisted from this patient chart. If you do not vacate the premises, I will summon hospital security to escort you out." The tension in the lobby thickened. The other patients stopped reading their magazines. They watched the confrontation unfold in stunned silence. The beeping machines, the rustling pages, the quiet murmurs all ceased. I stood behind the drywall listening to the standoff. A primal instinct urged me to retreat. I could step back into the alcove. I could let the nurses handle the dispute. I could let security drag my parents out the sliding doors while I hid in the shadows, preserving my fragile energy. But hiding validated their narrative. Hiding meant I still feared them. I thought about the lodgepole pines outside my studio window. They require the fire to release their seeds. They do not shrink from the heat. They use it. I pushed away from the wall. I walked around the corner and stepped into the open lobby. My boots clicked against the polished linoleum, drawing every eye in the room. I looked pale. The harsh fluorescent lights emphasized the dark hollows beneath my eyes and the sharp angles of my jaw. I wore the gray wool beanie pulled low over my bare scalp. My oversized sweater hung loosely over my thin frame, but my spine remained perfectly straight. I did not slouch. I did not shrink. I walked to the center of the room, stopping 10 feet away from my family. The electric charge in the air intensified. The two opposing forces finally met face to face in an arena filled with silent, captive strangers. Brenda stared at my sunken cheeks. Emma stared at my beanie. Richard stared at my unwavering posture. For the first time in 26 years, they looked at their target and realized the weapon they brought was entirely useless. I kept my hands resting calmly in my pockets. I looked at the cheap plastic wrapping around the carnations. I looked at the glowing lens of the smartphone. Then I met my father's dark, calculating gaze. The ambush was set, but I controlled the battlefield. I did not raise my voice, but when I spoke, the words echoed off every tile in the room. Before the delivery receipt even registered, I tapped the contact menu, scrolled down, and selected Block Caller. The phone went dark. The studio returned to its rhythmic quiet. The silence felt different now. It felt like a heavy vault locking into place. Brenda saw me standing in the center of the linoleum floor. Her gaze flickered over my sunken cheeks and the gray wool covering my bare scalp. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock breached her curated facade. She had not witnessed the physical toll the poison took on my body. But the shock vanished, instantly replaced by the glowing red recording light on Emma's smartphone. Brenda remembered her audience. She remembered the narrative she needed to construct for her country club peers. She swooped in, expecting me to collapse into her embrace. She anticipated a tearful reunion she could post online to repair the social damage from the charity gala. She wanted a digital receipt of her maternal devotion. I did not move toward her. I kept my hands firmly inside the pockets of my oversized sweater. As she closed the final few feet of distance, I took one deliberate, calculated step backward. Brenda's arms clamped shut around empty air. The carnation smacked against her own tailored beige raincoat. She stumbled, slightly thrown off balance by my physical rejection. The movement was small, but the impact echoed like a gunshot in the hushed lobby. Emma lowered her phone a fraction, her mouth falling open. The camera lens captured her mother grasping at nothing. A murmur rippled through the seated patients. They recognized a stage performance when they saw one. Brenda straightened her spine and her cheeks flushing a dull mottled red. The embarrassment quickly curdled into resentment. She opened her mouth to pivot into a victim routine, preparing to tell the room how her sick daughter stubbornly pushed away her loving family. Richard intervened before she could speak. He recognized the failure of the emotional approach. He stepped around his wife, positioning his broad shoulders between me and the rest of the clinic. He wanted to block my view of the nurses' station. He wanted to isolate me. He adjusted the cuffs of his crisp navy suit. He leaned forward, invading my personal space. He dropped his voice to a low, menacing register designed to convey ultimate authority. It was the exact tone he used during hostile corporate negotiations when he wanted to force a smaller company into liquidation. "Stop being difficult, Adeline," he ordered. The words felt sharp and cold. "You are embarrassing your mother in a public setting. We do not have time for this rebellious phase. Hand Emma the car keys right now. If you make me ask you one more time, I will step out into that parking lot and place the phone call to your property manager. You will be packing your apartment into trash bags by tomorrow evening. The choice is yours." He delivered the ultimatum expecting me to shatter. He anticipated tears. He expected me to drop my gaze, tremble, and reach into my pockets to surrender my only lifeline. He relied on the old version of me, the girl who absorbed their cruelty to keep the peace. I did not scream. I did not cry. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. The 28 days of isolation burned away the fragile parts of my spirit, leaving only the hardened core. I looked at the man who threatened to render me homeless while I recovered from a deadly disease. He held zero power over me. I reached into the canvas tote bag hanging from my shoulder. The rough fabric brushed against my knuckles. I bypassed my wallet and the black plastic key fob. My fingers closed around a thick manila envelope. I pulled the envelope free. The hospital legal department seal sat stamped across the front in dark blue ink. The paper felt heavy and substantial, containing the notarized documentation Helen drafted just 48 hours prior. I held the packet out, holding it suspended in the space between us. Richard stared at the envelope. He frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together. He expected metal keys. He did not understand paper. He reached out and snatched the envelope from my grip, his movements sharp and impatient. I did not whisper. I did not shout. I modulated my voice, ensuring the pitch remained crystal clear and loud enough for every single person in the reception area to hear my words. "If you contact my landlord, I will immediately press formal charges for extortion," I stated. My voice rang through the lobby, striking the tile walls and echoing back. "I have the voicemail saved and date-stamped. Furthermore, you are no longer authorized to dictate my life." Richard paused, his thumb wedged under the paper flap of the envelope. Emma stopped recording, her phone hovering uselessly near her chest. "That envelope contains a cease and desist order drafted by the hospital legal team." I continued, keeping my posture unyielding. It also contains the formal, notarized revocation of your healthcare proxy. You are permanently barred from my medical records. You are stripped of all visitation privileges. You no longer possess any legal right to my physical body or my financial assets. If you ever threaten my housing again, my fiduciary will file a restraining order." The lobby plunged into a dead, suffocating silence. The magazines remained untouched on the end tables. The intake phone stopped ringing. Every patient, nurse, and administrative worker watched the scene unfold with unwavering attention. They witnessed a father attempt to extort a cancer patient, and they just watched that patient construct an impenetrable fortress. Richard ripped the flap open. He pulled the thick stack of legal documents free. His eyes scanned the heavy parchment paper. He read the bold headings. He saw the ironclad clauses Helen constructed. He observed the official brass notary seal resting at the bottom of the page, alongside Dr. Silas Thorne's strict medical attestation. He searched for a loophole. He hunted for a misspelled name or an expired date. He looked for a weakness he could exploit in probate court. He found nothing but a sheer vertical wall. The color drained from his face. The rigid, menacing composure fractured. His skin turned a pale, sickly gray under the fluorescent lights. The reality of his lost control washed over him. He realized the legal tether binding me to his authority was severed. He could no longer leverage my medical vulnerability. He could no longer dangle my survival over my head to secure a commute for his favored child. Brenda peered over his shoulder, reading the formal revocation clauses. Her breath hitched in her throat. The performative facade crumbled, leaving behind the panicked expression of a woman realizing her favorite prop just walked off the stage. "You did this," Richard muttered. His voice sounded thin, devoid of its former corporate power. "You really locked us out?" "I locked the door," I corrected him. "You handed me the bricks." I stood my ground, watching the realization sink deep into their minds. They marched into this ward expecting an easy surrender. They brought a camera to film a victory. Instead, they received a formal eviction from my existence. The silence in the room stretched heavy and absolute. I felt a surge of quiet, triumphant relief settling into my bones. The proxy threat was eliminated. But the confrontation remained far from finished. Richard Vance built his entire identity around dominance. Losing the legal proxy stripped his long-term control, but his ego refused to accept a total public defeat. He still needed to secure a victory today. He still needed to walk out of those sliding glass doors holding a prize to salvage his shattered pride. He looked away from the legal documents and locked his gaze back onto my canvas bag. He prepared to pivot his attack, bringing forth his final, desperate claim. If the legal avenue remained shut, he would break through the financial window. He squared his shoulders, attempting to inflate his physical presence. His face flushed with a dark, volatile color. He abandoned the low, intimidating register he used earlier. Instead, he raised his vocal pitch, ensuring his words reached the farthest corners of the waiting area. He intended to publicly shame me into submission. He wanted to construct a new narrative for the captive audience sitting in the vinyl chairs. "You are the most ungrateful child I have ever encountered," Richard declared. His voice dripped with manufactured betrayal. "We provided you with a privileged upbringing. We paid for your art supplies when you chose a useless career path. And now you stand here acting like a victim over a simple request? You seem to forget who put you in that driver's seat 4 years ago. I paid the $3,000 down payment for that Subaru. That money came directly from my checking account. I own equity in that machine. You owe me that vehicle. Give your sister the keys right now, or I will flag the registration as stolen property by the end of the business day." He crossed his arms over his chest, radiating smug satisfaction. He believed he'd just played an unbeatable card. He assumed my exhaustion and the public setting would force a concession. He thought I lacked the cognitive clarity to remember the financial details from 4 winters past. Emma perked up. The confusion vanished from her perfectly contoured face. She adjusted her grip on her smartphone, ensuring the camera lens captured my impending defeat. Brenda adjusted her silk scarf, offering a tragic nod of agreement. They stood united in their delusion, waiting for me to crumble. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his shouting. I allowed a deep, profound silence to settle over the room for a long moment. I let his loud, aggressive demands hang in the sterile air, exposing the sheer absurdity of his claim. He stood in a cancer ward, screaming at a bald, 26-year-old woman about a car down payment. The patients in the lobby glared at him. A man hooked to a portable oxygen tank shook his head in disgust. My father operated under the assumption that I managed my finances with the same careless disregard as Emma. Emma relied on a continuous allowance. She overdrew her accounts, purchasing designer handbags, and expected our parents to cover the negative balances. I lived a completely different existence. As a botanical illustrator, managing independent commissions, I operated as my own accounting department. I tracked every single invoice, supply purchase, and tax deduction with ruthless precision. I treated my personal ledger with the same exactitude I applied to mapping the cellular structure of a cedar leaf. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. The glass screen felt cool against my palm. I unlocked the device using my thumbprint. I did not rush. I navigated through my applications with calm, deliberate movements. I opened my secure banking portal and accessed the archived document folder. I had spent yesterday afternoon organizing this exact digital trail. Richard watched my fingers tap the screen. His smug expression faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He did not anticipate a research session. He expected tears and a surrendered plastic fob. I found the highlighted document. I held the phone steady. I looked directly into my father's eyes, ensuring he recognized the unwavering certainty in my gaze. "You wired $3,000 to my checking account 4 winters ago," I stated, keeping my tone conversational, but loud enough for the audience to hear. "You offered the funds so I could purchase studded snow tires and secure the initial dealership deposit. You told me it was a gift to keep your daughter safe on the icy Oregon roads." Richard nodded, forcefully pointing a finger at my chest. "Exactly," he interrupted. "It was my capital. That makes it family property." I held up my free hand, silencing him. I looked back down at the glowing screen. 4 months later, I secured a major illustration contract for a university biology textbook. I continued reading the digital text. On the 12th of April, 3 years ago, I initiated an outgoing electronic wire transfer. I routed the funds directly into your primary mutual bank account. The routing identifier ended in 482. The transaction confirmation code is Alpha 79er3 Delta. I sent you $3,100. I included an extra $100 to cover any perceived interest. The memo line on the receipt clearly reads repayment for vehicle deposit in full. The words struck him like physical blows. He opened his mouth, but his jaw worked silently. "Furthermore," I added, dropping my hand and locking my eyes onto his pale face, "the state of Oregon issued the formal title certificate 30 days after I finalized the dealership paperwork. My name is the only name printed on that government document. There are no lien holders. There are no co-signers. The title sits in a locked filing cabinet inside my apartment, free and clear. You do not own a single ounce of equity in my property. You are attempting to steal a vehicle from a cancer patient so your healthy, unemployed daughter can avoid riding a municipal bus." The public humiliation became absolute. The carefully constructed narrative of the benevolent, worried parents shattered completely. The strangers in the lobby no longer saw a tragic family dealing with a rebellious child. They saw petty extortionists. They saw a wealthy couple trying to strip a vulnerable, sick woman of her only reliable transportation. The air in the clinic turned hostile against them. The charge nurse, Sarah, stepped forward, her arms still crossed, but a satisfied gleam shining in her eyes. The patients murmured among themselves, casting judgment upon the trio standing near the reception desk. Richard stood frozen. His corporate intimidation tactics dissolved into dust. His legal threats were neutralized by the proxy revocation. His financial extortion was publicly dismantled by a bank confirmation number. He had nothing left to leverage. He stood exposed, stripped of his power and his dignity, in a room full of strangers. Brenda clutched the cheap pink carnations against her chest. The plastic wrapper crinkled loudly in her trembling hands. She looked around the lobby, seeking a sympathetic face. She found only contempt. The community she desperately wanted to impress would hear about this display. The whispers from the charity gala would merge with the testimonies of the nurses and patients in this ward. Her social standing was undergoing a permanent demolition. Emma stared at the screen of her smartphone. The red recording icon blinked steadily in the corner of the display. She had intended to film a touching family reconciliation or a dramatic victory over her stubborn sister. Instead, she had digitally immortalized her parents' total defeat. She captured Richard attempting to steal a car and getting factually destroyed by a bank receipt. She captured Brenda, pathetic performative gasps. She captured her own complicity. Emma's thumb hovered over the stop button. Her lower lip trembled. The glossy designer facade cracked, revealing a panicked, spoiled girl who suddenly realized her family possessed no real power. She slowly lowered the device, her spray-tanned fingers shaking. The silence stretched tight, wrapping around my family like a suffocating blanket. I had successfully defended my fortress. I stood in the center of the linoleum floor, a bald 26-year-old botanical illustrator, and I had single-handedly dismantled a corporate executive and a country club socialite. But the universe demands a final verdict. The natural order of the Pacific Northwest dictates that after a storm ravages the landscape, a higher authority steps in to clear the wreckage. My parents stood paralyzed by their own exposure, unsure of how to retreat with their shattered egos. They needed a definitive push out the sliding glass doors. Silas represented the absolute pinnacle of Pacific Northwest Medical Society. He sat on the board of directors for 3 regional charities. He held a premium membership at the exact country club where Brenda desperately curated her flawless image. For over a decade, my parents spent immense energy attempting to cultivate his friendship, hoping his prestige would elevate their own status. They invited him to expensive catered dinners and offered him top-tier seats at silent auctions. They treated him like a vital rung on their social ladder. Right now, Richard stared at the doctor, hoping his affluent peer would intervene and restore order. My father mistakenly believed Silas would side with a wealthy executive over a stubborn sick patient. Richard attempted to recover his shattered dignity. He stood taller, adjusting the knot of his silk tie. He offered Silas a stiff nod, attempting to project a sense of shared corporate brotherhood. "Silas, my friend," Richard said, trying to force a casual tone despite the visible sweat shining on his brow, "we are just dealing with a minor familial misunderstanding today. Adeline is confused and we are trying to bring her home." Silas did not return the nod. He did not acknowledge the familiar greeting. He looked at Richard with an expression resembling carved glacial ice. He consulted the silver tablet, running his index finger down a digital chart. The silence in the room thickened, wrapping around my parents like a tightening net. "You are trespassing," Richard Silas stated. His voice resonated with a quiet, lethal calm. "I am the attending physician for this ward. I reviewed the formal legal directives drafted and notarized in my presence 48 hours ago. You do not hold medical proxy status. You do not hold visitation clearance. You are violating a direct legal boundary established by my patient." Brenda stepped forward, offering a trembling, pathetic smile. "Silas, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. "You know us. You know our family. We just came to bring flowers and check on our sick girl. She needs her mother." Silas shifted his clinical piercing gaze to my mother. He looked at her tailored beige raincoat and the cheap pink carnations wrapped in crinkling plastic. He let out a slow, steady breath. "I have practiced oncology for 3 decades, Brenda," he declared. He amplified his voice slightly, ensuring the precise syllables reached the back row of vinyl waiting chairs. "During those 30 years, I have watched mothers sleep on hard hospital floors for weeks just to hold their children. I have seen fathers drain their retirement accounts to purchase experimental medications. I have witnessed profound human sacrifice and unconditional love in its most desperate forms." Silas took a single, deliberate step closer to my parents, forcing them to shrink back. "What I have never witnessed," Silas continued, the cold fury radiating from his rigid posture, "is a family abandoning their daughter to endure 28 days of brutal chemotherapy alone. I have never seen parents ignore a cancer patient for a month, only to march into my clinic and attempt to extort her only mode of transportation so their healthy younger child can avoid a municipal bus schedule." The words landed with the concussive force of a detonated building. Silas stripped away the final shreds of their curated illusion. He exposed the ugly, hollow truth of their existence in front of a captive audience. The charge nurse, Sarah, stood taller, a tight, satisfied smile forming on her lips. A profound gasp echoed from an older woman sitting near the magazines. The receptionist, Diane, stared at my mother with unmasked disgust. Brenda's face crumbled. The carefully painted mask of the tragic martyr disintegrated into ruin. Her lower lip quivered, and a genuine, raw sob escaped her throat. Real tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her expensive false eyelashes and tracking through her spray tan. These were not the calculated, elegant tears she displayed for her country club peers during charity luncheons. These were tears of pure, unadulterated shame. She realized the family friend she relied upon for social leverage just publicly branded her a monster. She understood that Silas would carry this story back to the charity boards and the elite dining rooms. Her reputation was permanently incinerated. The social currency she farmed from my illness just turned to ash in her hands. "Leave this facility immediately," Silas ordered, pointing his index finger toward the sliding glass doors. "If you remain in this lobby for one more minute, I will instruct security to physically remove you, and I will have you cited for criminal trespassing on a restricted medical ward." Richard did not attempt another defense. The bank receipt broke his financial leverage, and the respected physician destroyed his social standing. He lacked the ammunition to continue the fight. He grabbed Brenda by the elbow, pulling her roughly toward the exit. Emma followed closely behind them, her designer suede boots stumbling awkwardly over the polished linoleum. She kept her phone lowered, her face pale and terrified. She finally grasped the reality that her entitled demands caused the total collapse of her family empire. They pushed through the mechanical doors, rushing out into the damp Oregon morning. They looked like panicked refugees fleeing a conquered city. I watched them scurry across the wet concrete parking lot, heading toward their silver SUV. The rain began to fall harder, washing against the glass panes of the lobby windows, blurring their retreating figures. They climbed into their vehicle, pulling away from the curb with a loud screech of tires. The red taillights faded into the gray mist, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence inside the clinic. Silas turned toward me. The glacial anger melted from his features, replaced by a quiet, respectful warmth. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder, offering a brief, grounding touch. "You established a formidable boundary, Adeline," he told me softly. "You stood your ground against a terrible storm. Now you need to focus on healing your body. The legal machinery will protect you from their reach." I nodded, feeling a sudden wave of physical exhaustion wash over my limbs. The adrenaline leaving my system left my joints aching and my muscles feeling like lead. I walked back toward the curtained alcove to finish my saline flush. The nurses offered me soft, encouraging smiles as I passed their station. I had entered the clinic anticipating a minor medical procedure and ended up executing a flawless defense of my own survival. I proved that the resilience required to fight a deadly disease translates perfectly into the strength required to banish toxic lineage. I stood in the shadow of the mountain, and I did not break. But the impact of this lobby confrontation extended far beyond the hospital walls. Silas Thorne did not construct empty threats. He carried immense influence, and he possessed a long, precise memory. My parents believed their humiliation ended when they drove out of the medical center parking lot. They assumed they could retreat to their sprawling mid-century modern home and wait for the scandal to blow over. They thought their affluent neighbors would eventually forget the rumors. They underestimated the speed at which a community polices its own borders. If you want to know how a single public confrontation unravels an entire social kingdom, keep listening to Morning Revenge. Hit subscribe and let us examine the swift, devastating ripple effect that swept through the Pacific Northwest elite, leaving my parents drowning in an ocean of quiet exile. The Pacific Northwest elite operates on a very specific currency. Wealth provides the foundation, but reputation serves as the actual lifeblood of that society. Affluent circles in this region do not tolerate messy public scandals. They prefer their cruelty hidden behind high hedges and polite smiles. When the ugly truth breaches the surface, they do not yell or throw objects. They simply close ranks and construct an impenetrable wall of ice around the offending party. Dr. Silas Thorne understood this social architecture better than anyone. He did not need to shout from a rooftop to destroy my parents. He only needed to speak the quiet, undeniable truth in the correct rooms. The following Tuesday, Silas attended a quarterly luncheon for the Regional Hospital Philanthropy Board. The guest list included real estate developers, managing directors, and the most influential philanthropists in the state. Many of these individuals were the exact same donors Brenda had attempted to manipulate at the weekend gala. They sat around a long mahogany table eating cedar plank salmon and discussing upcoming charity initiatives. Silas waited for a lull in the conversation. He placed his linen napkin on the table and cleared his throat. He brought up a new initiative for patient advocacy funds. He stated the hospital required tighter security protocols to protect vulnerable patients from financial exploitation. A board member asked for an example. Silas folded his hands, resting them on the polished wood. He described a recent incident in his own oncology ward. He detailed a scenario where parents abandoned their daughter through a brutal 28-day chemotherapy cycle. He explained how those same parents stormed a restricted clinical area to extort the patient for her vehicle. He did not use my name. He did not need to. He simply looked at the woman who had listened to Brenda spin her fictional caregiving tale days prior. The connection clicked into place behind her eyes. The story swept through the room like a sudden winter freeze. Wealthy, influential people despise being played for fools. Brenda had collected their sympathy and their casseroles under false pretenses. She made them unwitting participants in her narcissistic performance. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, my parents' social death warrant was signed and sealed. The execution was swift and devastatingly quiet. Brenda experienced the first wave of the fallout on her smartphone. She thrived on digital validation. Her mornings usually began by reviewing the hundreds of likes and fawning comments left on her dramatic updates. On Wednesday morning, she uploaded a new post. She selected a filtered photograph of a rain-swept window pane. She typed a lengthy caption detailing the heartbreaking difficulty of misunderstood maternal love. She pressed publish and carried her coffee to the marble kitchen island, waiting for the notifications to roll in. An hour passed. The screen remained dark. She refreshed the application. The post showed 0 likes. No one commented offering prayers. No one told her to stay strong. She scrolled through her feed and noticed several prominent country club members had quietly removed her from their digital networks. Panic set in. She dressed in her finest tennis attire, grabbing her luxury gym bag. She drove to the country club for her standing Thursday luncheon with the event planning committee. She walked into the dining room, expecting the usual chorus of warm greetings. The dining room buzzed with the low hum of affluent conversation. Brenda approached her regular table near the floor-to-ceiling windows. 6 women sat sipping iced tea and eating mixed greens. As Brenda pulled out an empty chair, the conversation abruptly ceased. The silence fell over the table like a lead weight. A woman named Carol, the same woman who previously called Brenda the strongest mother she knew, picked up her cloth napkin. Carol did not smile. She did not offer a greeting. She looked at Brenda with an expression of clinical detachment. "This table is full," Brenda Carroll stated. Her voice lacked any trace of warmth. "In fact, the committee has decided to move in a different direction for the upcoming spring gala. We will no longer require your assistance." Brenda stood paralyzed, clutching the back of the empty chair. No one else spoke. The other women looked down at their plates or directed their gaze out the window toward the manicured golf greens. They erased her from their hierarchy in less than 30 seconds. Brenda turned and walked out of the dining room, her tennis shoes squeaking awkwardly against the hardwood floor. She spent the rest of the afternoon sitting alone in her sprawling house, suffocating in the sudden, crushing quiet. Richard faced a different arena of ruin. He operated as a senior partner at a prominent corporate acquisitions firm downtown. He built his career on a reputation of ruthless competence and unshakable integrity. He arrived at his corner office on Friday morning, expecting a routine day of closing negotiations. He walked down the long carpeted hallway holding his leather briefcase. The junior associates, who normally offered bright, eager morning greetings, suddenly found reasons to look at their shoes or duck into adjacent cubicles as he passed. Richard reached his desk and noticed his calendar had been altered. A major client meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock was reassigned to a rival partner. His desk phone chimed. The managing director requested his immediate presence in the boardroom. Richard entered the room expecting a discussion about quarterly projections. Instead, he found the managing director sitting at the head of the long glass table holding a printed email. The director did not offer Richard a seat. "Our firm survives on trust and reputation." The director began, keeping his tone low and dangerous. "We handle delicate financial transitions for family-owned corporations across the Pacific Northwest. Our clients must believe we possess a fundamental moral compass." Richard tightened his grip on his briefcase, feeling a cold dread pool in his stomach. "Rumors are circulating through the Rotary clubs and the hospital boards," the director continued. "Prominent individuals are discussing a senior partner at this firm who attempted to steal a car from his own child while she suffered in a cancer ward. They are saying you threatened to terminate her apartment lease to secure a vehicle for a joyride." "That is a private family dispute," Richard countered, his voice sounding remarkably thin and hollow. "It has no bearing on my corporate performance." "It has every bearing on your judgment," the director snapped. "You demonstrated a predatory instinct against a vulnerable, sick dependent. If you will extort a cancer patient for a used vehicle, our clients will assume you will bleed their companies dry without a second thought. You are now a walking liability to this firm." Richard was not fired that day, but he was professionally neutered. The firm stripped him of his premium accounts. They removed him from public-facing negotiations. He was relegated to reviewing sterile contracts in his office, while the younger partners absorbed his commissions. His corporate power vanished, replaced by the avert gazes and whispered disgust of his colleagues. He was trapped in a glass cage of his own making. Emma did not escape the shockwave. Her marketing internship was located at a high-end downtown real estate agency. The chief executive of that agency happened to be married to one of the hospital philanthropists Silas spoke to at the luncheon. On Friday afternoon, Human Resources called Emma into a small, windowless office. They informed her the internship program was undergoing unexpected budget cuts. They handed her a final paycheck and requested her security badge. Emma walked out of the glass skyscraper carrying a cardboard box filled with her desk supplies. She stood on the wet pavement watching the Portland traffic rush past. She reached for her smartphone to call a premium rideshare service. Her banking application sent a push notification warning her of insufficient funds. Her parents' accounts were frozen due to Richard suddenly losing his quarterly bonuses. Emma looked down the street at the green municipal bus stop shelter. She pulled her designer trench coat tighter around her shoulders and began walking through the freezing rain toward public transit. While my family drowned in their self-inflicted social exile, I sat in my quiet apartment. The air inside my studio felt pure and breathable. I stood at my drafting table, looking out the window at the rugged tree line. I held a fresh Micron pen in my hand. The lingering numbness in my fingertips was finally fading. The nausea that haunted me for 28 days had dissolved. The poison was leaving my system, replaced by a fierce, quiet energy. Revenge did not require a dramatic screaming match. It did not require throwing objects or slashing tires. The most devastating retaliation was simply walking away and letting the truth perform its own brutal work. I built a fortress out of boundaries, and my family shattered their teeth trying to bite through the stone. I lay still inside the narrow cylindrical tube for 45 minutes. The magnetic coils clattered and knocked in a chaotic rhythm around my skull. I focused on my breathing. I inhaled the sterile scent of the medical plastic. I did not feel the crushing anxiety that accompanied my initial diagnostic scans months ago. The legal fortress I built around my life provided a strange psychological armor. Whatever the machine discovered inside my tissues belonged solely to me. Brenda could not post the results on her social media feed. Richard could not leverage the prognosis to control my housing. I owned my illness, and I owned my recovery. The technician slid the table out of the machine. I dressed in my oversized sweater and walked down the quiet corridor to examination room 4. I sat on the padded table listening to the crinkle of the sanitary paper beneath my jeans. Dr. Silas Thorne opened the wooden door. He carried his silver tablet, but his posture lacked the usual clinical rigidity. The deep grooves around his mouth relaxed into a genuine warm smile. He did not make me wait for the verdict. He did not build false suspense. He looked me directly in the eyes and delivered the words I spent half a year praying to hear. The scans show zero evidence of disease, Adeline Silas announced. His voice resonated with profound satisfaction. The margins are clear. Your white blood cell count stabilized within the normal, healthy range. The chemical protocol achieved exactly what we intended. You are officially in remission. I let out a long breath. The air emptied from my lungs, carrying away months of suppressed terror. The rigid tension holding my shoulders near my ears finally dissolved. I slumped forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. I looked down at my hands. The yellow discoloration on my fingernails was growing out, revealing healthy pink beds underneath. The tremor that haunted my grip for weeks was gone. You endured a grueling protocol, Silas continued, leaning against the counter. You navigated the physical trauma while managing an unprecedented level of external hostility. Your biological resilience is remarkable, but your psychological endurance is what truly saved your life. I looked up at the respected physician. Has the hospital administration heard any further demands from my family? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Silas shook his head. His smile hardened into an expression of grim approval. Not a single phone call. The legal proxy revocation functioned perfectly. The administrative staff flagged their names across the entire regional network. They are ghosts in this system. Furthermore, the social environment outside this clinic proved equally inhospitable for them. They learned very quickly that intimidation tactics fail when the target refuses to flinch. I thanked Silas for his medical expertise and his unwavering advocacy. I gathered my canvas tote bag and walked out of the examination room. I retraced my steps down the corridor, passing the exact spot near the reception desk where my father attempted to extort my vehicle. The linoleum floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, holding no trace of the battle fought there a month prior. It was just a waiting room again. I pushed through the sliding glass doors and stepped onto the damp concrete. The crisp winter air filled my lungs, tasting sharp and clean. I walked through the parking structure and approached my Subaru. The vehicle sat exactly where I parked it. I unlocked the doors, hearing the familiar, reassuring chirp of the security system. I climbed into the driver's seat and gripped the leather steering wheel. The material felt cold against my palms. For the past 6 months, every trip in this car involved a desperate commute between my apartment and a medical facility. The vehicle served as a transport module for survival. Today, the engine offered a different promise. I turned the ignition. The dashboard illuminated. I did not shift the gear into reverse and point the tires toward my cramped studio apartment. I needed open space. I needed to see the geography that taught me how to survive the frost. I pulled out of the medical district and merged onto Interstate 84, heading east. The city skyline shrank in my rearview mirror. The concrete overpasses and glass office buildings gave way to the sprawling, untamed beauty of the Columbia River Gorge. The highway hugged the edge of the rushing water. The river churned a deep slate gray, reflecting the overcast sky above. Steep basalt cliffs rose on either side of the asphalt, covered in dense layers of dark green pine and vibrant yellow moss. The heater hummed, pushing warm air across my knuckles. I cracked the window an inch, letting the scent of damp earth and crushed pine needles fill the cabin. I drove past the towering waterfalls that carved deep, vertical grooves into the ancient stone. The water plummeted hundreds of feet, crashing into the pools below with untamed ferocity. The elevation increased as the road wound higher into the Cascade Mountain range. The dense cloud cover began to fracture. Shafts of pale golden sunlight pierced the gray canopy, illuminating patches of the evergreen forest. I navigated a sweeping curve and the horizon suddenly opened. Mount Hood broke through the parting clouds dominating the skyline. The stratovolcano stood stark and unyielding against the winter sky. Glacial ice coated the jagged peaks, reflecting the sunlight with blinding intensity. The sheer scale of the peak made the surrounding landscape look fragile and temporary. I engaged the turn signal and pulled the Subaru into a gravel scenic viewpoint. The tires crunched to a halt. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the biting wind. The cold stung my cheeks, but I did not reach for my wool beanie. A fine layer of new hair covered my scalp, a soft, defiant promise of returning health. I leaned against the hood of my car, staring across the vast timberline toward the summit. I retrieved my sketchbook and a micron pen from my canvas bag. I rested the heavy paper against the metal roof of the car. I began to draw. I did not map the delicate veins of a fern today. I sketched the harsh, jagged tree line. I traced the boundary where the dense forest stopped and the unforgiving alpine rock began. As the ink flowed across the page, a profound realization settled into my mind. During the darkest 28 days of the chemotherapy, I believed resilience meant fighting. I thought survival required a constant draining output of energy to deflect the cruelty of the people supposed to protect me. I viewed my quiet endurance as a weakness. Looking at the mountain, I understood the truth. True resilience does not resemble a screaming match in a hospital lobby. It does not look like desperate extortion or performative social media posts. True resilience looks exactly like the basalt rock looming in the distance. The mountain does not argue with the winter storms, it does not negotiate with the blizzards or attempt to explain its position to the gale force winds. The mountain simply stands its ground. It allows the severe weather to crash against its slopes. It lets the loud, chaotic noise blow past its peak. When the storm eventually exhausts its energy and dissipates into the atmosphere, the mountain remains unchanged, unshaken, and firmly rooted to the earth. I survived the chemical poison dripping into my veins. I survived a mother who farmed my tragedy for country club prestige. I survived a father who weaponized my shelter to secure a luxury commute for his favored child. I weathered the bitter frost of their betrayal, and I did not bend. I saved myself. I forged a shield out of my own solitude. The legal documents sitting in the hospital archives served as the initial barrier, but my internal boundaries provided the true defense. Those boundaries were no longer fragile lines drawn in the sand. They were solid, unyielding bedrock. I finished the sketch, adding a final layer of crosshatching to the shaded crevices of the glacier. I closed the book and capped my pen. The wind howled through the gorge, carrying the distinct promise of a coming snowfall. I felt entirely at peace. I sat inside the cold cabin of the Subaru, staring at the glowing screen of my smartphone. The wind howled through the Columbia River Gorge, buffeting the metal frame of the vehicle, but the interior remained a quiet sanctuary. The email notification shining on the display originated from the senior editor at the University Publishing House. The subject line indicated an urgent contract revision. I tapped the screen and read the black text against the bright white background. The editorial board reviewed my preliminary botanical illustrations of the native Oregon flora. They admired the anatomical precision of the root systems and the intricate shading of the foliage. The board decided to expand the single textbook project into a comprehensive 3-volume series. The attached digital contract included a financial advance generous enough to cover my apartment rent, my studio supplies, and my living expenses for the next 2 calendar years. I locked the screen and set the device on the passenger seat. I looked through the windshield at the jagged peak of Mount Hood. A profound warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the lingering winter chill. The financial security felt like a thick wool blanket settling over my shoulders. I did not require a cosigner to maintain my lease. I did not need a guarantor to secure my shelter. I possessed a specialized skill set that provided a solid, unyielding foundation for my future. I put the vehicle in drive and steered back toward the city, leaving the high altitude behind. The winter turned into a mild, vibrant spring. I sat at my drafting table in my quiet studio. The afternoon sunlight poured through the window glass, catching the dust motes hovering in the air. The snow on the mountain began to melt, revealing the dark, jagged basalt rock beneath the receding glaciers. I leaned over a large sheet of archival paper, working on the expanded commission. My tools lay organized across the wooden desk. The micron pens, the graphite pencils, and the colored ink bottles sat in neat, precise rows. I held a fine brush tracing the subtle curve of a trillium petal. My hand moved with a steady, unbroken rhythm. The yellow discoloration on my fingernails was a distant memory, replaced by healthy pink nail beds. A thick layer of soft brown hair covered my head, curling slightly around my ears. The hollow shadows under my cheekbones filled in, replacing the ghostly pallor with a warm flush. The physical healing mirrored the internal peace anchoring my mind. The rhythmic scratching of the pen against the textured paper provided the only sound in the room. I looked at the black plastic key fob resting near my inkwell. The conflict originated over a simple mode of transportation, but the vehicle represented a much deeper battle line. Brenda and Richard demanded the car because they believed they owned the right to measure my worth. They used a rigid, toxic ruler, assigning value based on compliance and public utility. I refused to let them hold the ruler. I reclaimed my autonomy not by fighting loud battles in public arenas, but by drawing a line they could not cross. I built a fortress out of boundaries. I used legal documents and bank receipts as the mortar. I used silence as the stone. The people who were supposed to protect me during my darkest days chose to exploit my vulnerability. I survived the poison in my veins and the betrayal in my family by standing my ground like the timberline facing a winter storm. I am healthy, I am independent, I am at peace. I did not just keep my car, I won back my entire life by refusing to let them measure my worth. Welcome back to Morning Revenge. If you have ever had to build a fortress out of your own boundaries to survive the people who were supposed to protect you, you are not alone. Hit subscribe and stay tuned to see how the next quiet victory unfolds. In traditional American culture, the family is envisioned as the ultimate sanctuary, a cooperative, loyal unit grounded in fairness, emotional awareness, and mutual protection. Parenting is, at its core, a sacred responsibility of long-term guidance, not a mechanism for extracting social currency or managing public relations. Brenda and Richard Vance represent the dark, hollow inversion of this ideal. They replace the foundational pillars of honesty and unconditional support with the superficial pursuit of country club prestige and toxic favoritism. By weaponizing a cancer patient's housing and transportation to indulge their golden child Emma, they destroyed the very sanctuary they were tasked with protecting. The message to parents here is urgent and severe. A child's trust is a fragile, exhaustible resource. When you substitute genuine emotional presence for public performance, you do not raise a family, you cultivate an audience. And audiences, as Brenda learned in the dead, suffocating silence of her charity luncheons, inevitably walk out when the curtain falls on a lie. True family education requires the courage to sit in the dark, unglamorous rooms of human suffering, offering a steady hand rather than holding a camera. Furthermore, fostering blind entitlement in one child while demanding relentless sacrifice from the other is a profound failure of familial justice. By shielding Emma from the realities of effort, consequence, and empathy, Brenda and Richard crippled her ability to navigate the actual world. Emma's swift termination from her downtown internship, brought on by her petulant refusal to ride a municipal bus, is the direct tragic result of parents who prioritized aesthetic comfort over character development. Fairness in parenting is not always about the equal distribution of financial assets. It is about providing each child with the honest, grounded guidance they need to build their own resilience. When parents fail to balance this scale, they do not just harm the neglected child, they fundamentally ruin the favored one. Through the crucible of her physical and emotional illness, Adeline imparts a vital, bleeding message to young people navigating the treacherous waters of conditional love. Her quiet triumph is a testament to the absolute necessity of self-reliance. To the youth standing in the shadow of negligent guardians, Adeline's actions declare a powerful truth. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep your family warm. When the people tasked with your protection become your greatest threat, true resilience means becoming the ruthless architect of your own fortress. Adeline did not win her freedom by screaming in a hospital lobby or begging for affection from an empty well. She won it through the quiet, meticulous execution of legal boundaries, financial independence, and a refusal to participate in their delusion. She teaches the next generation that dignity is not granted by our parents. It is forged in the fires of our own autonomy. Do not allow anyone, no matter their blood relation, to hold the ruler that measures your human worth. Stepping back to observe this fractured landscape through the lens of a spiritual practitioner, the narrative reveals a deeper existential sickness plaguing our current society. We are witnessing a culture desperately obsessed with the external, the curated digital image, the designer trench coat, the corporate title, while the internal soul is left to starve in the dark. The spiritual message to American parents is a desperate call back to the practice of self-cultivation. We cannot guide our children toward wisdom, morality, and resilience if we ourselves are lost in the labyrinth of ego and material illusion. The universe, in its infinite and terrifying balance, always corrects a distortion of truth. Brenda and Richard's rapid social exile was not an accident of gossip. It was the inevitable karmic result of their own spiritual bankruptcy. To raise a child with true resilience, parents must first cultivate their own inner landscape. They must practice the quiet, invisible virtues of empathy and self-sacrifice, entirely detached from the applause of their peers. Suffering, like the grueling days of chemotherapy Adeline endured, strips away the false self and reveals the bedrock of the spirit. When we focus on cultivating our own morality, we naturally foster an environment where our children can grow deep, unshakable roots. We must teach them that true wealth is not the vehicle parked in the driveway or the square footage of the estate, but the quiet peace that accompanies a clear, unburdened conscience. We are taught from childhood that forgiveness is the ultimate virtue, the necessary bridge to healing, and that family is an unbreakable sacred circle. But perhaps the most dangerous myth of American domestic life is the belief that reconciliation is always synonymous with peace. Sometimes the highest form of love you can offer a deeply broken family is the absolute unyielding finality of your absence. True healing does not always look like a mended relationship or a tearful reunion. Sometimes it looks like a permanently locked door. As the snow melts on the basalt rock and the mountain stands entirely alone, we are left to wonder, when we finally cut away every toxic branch of our lineage, do we become the orphans we always feared we were? Or do we finally, for the very first time, become ourselves